The air in the Blackmoor Great Hall didn't just smell like wealth. It smelled like apex predators and clinical indifference. It was a scent composed of expensive vetiver, aged scotch, and the faint metallic tang of ozone that always preceded a shift. I stood on the edge of the hand-tufted Persian rug, my fingers twisting the fabric of a simple sundress that felt increasingly like a costume in a room full of suits. I was Stacy Cole, a name that until 3 months ago meant nothing to the Blackmoor lineage. I was the daughter of a mid-tier beta family from a neighboring pack, brought here on the whim of a cosmic joke called the mate bond. When the bond had snapped into place during a cross-pack gala, it felt like the universe had suddenly turned the lights on in a dark room. Every cell in my body had hummed with a frequency I hadn't known existed. I looked at Dominic Blackmoor, the alpha of alphas, a man who controlled more hedge funds than most people had social media followers, and I saw my future. I saw a home. I saw the end of my loneliness. But as I stood there today, watching him stare out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the skyline of the city he essentially owned, that hum had turned into a frantic, jagged vibration of anxiety. "Dominic?" I whispered. My voice seemed to be swallowed by the high vaulted ceilings. He didn't turn. He remained a silhouette against the setting sun, his broad shoulders filling the frame of the window. He was wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit that fit him like armor. Dominic didn't just occupy space, he dominated it. Even his silence was a heavy, physical thing that pressed against my lungs. "The board met this morning, Stacy," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant cello, smooth but with an edge that could cut glass. "The Silver Moon Syndicate has finalized their terms for the merger. It's a deal that will expand our territory by 300 miles and secure our lithium interests for the next century." I frowned, a cold knot beginning to tie itself in my stomach. "Why are you telling me about lithium, Dominic? I thought we were going to talk about the solstice ceremony. My parents are asking about the formal announcement." Finally, he turned. His face was a masterpiece of cold, symmetrical perfection. His eyes, usually a burning amber when he looked at me in the dark of his bedroom, were now the color of flat, frozen honey. There was no recognition in them, no warmth, no mate. "There will be no solstice ceremony," he said. He began to walk toward me, his gait slow and predatory, "and there will be no announcement, at least, not the one you're expecting." "I don't understand," I said, though my wolf was already beginning to whine, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. She was pacing behind my ribs, her tail tucked, her ears pinned back. She knew the predator was hunting, and for the first time she realized she was the prey. Dominic stopped 5 feet from me. The distance felt like a canyon. "The Blackmoor legacy is not a fairy tale, Stacy. It is a machine, and a machine requires the right parts to function. You are lovely, you are kind, but you are a political vacuum. You bring no territory, no alliances, no strategic leverage." I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me lightheaded. "We are fated, Dominic. The moon chose us. You felt it, you know it. The moon is an ancient superstition used to justify biological impulses," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was the voice he used to fire CEOs and dismantle companies. "I am a man of the modern world. I do not let an impulse dictate the future of my empire. Lady Elena of the Silver Moon Syndicate is a high-ranking alpha. Her lineage is impeccable. Her father's resources are essential. She is the mate the Blackmoor Pack requires." "But she isn't your actual mate," I cried, my voice cracking. "I am. You can't just trade a soul for a merger." Dominic tilted his head, looking at me with something that resembled pity. It was worse than anger. "Watch me." He drew in a long, sharp breath, and I saw his chest expand. The power in the room shifted. It became thick, suffocating, as he tapped into the Alpha Prime authority that resided in his marrow. "Stacy Cole," he began, and the words didn't just come from his mouth, they vibrated through the floorboards. "I, Dominic Blackmoor, Alpha of the Blackmoor Pack, formally and irrevocably reject you as my fated mate. I invoke the old words of the First Forest. I sever the thread, I break the bond. From this moment forward, you are nothing to me, and I am nothing to you." The world didn't just end, it shattered. In the stories, they tell you rejection hurts. They tell you it's a heartbreak. They lie. It's not heartbreak, it's an execution. A white-hot bolt of agony slammed into my chest, radiating outward to my fingertips and toes. It felt as if a physical cord made of light and nerves had been hooked to a truck and ripped out of my spine. I let out a sound that wasn't human, a raw, guttural scream of the soul. I collapsed. My knees hit the marble floor with a bone-jarring thud, but I couldn't feel the floor. I could only feel the unmaking. It was as if my DNA was being rewritten in real time, the golden threads of the bond turning to ash inside my veins. My wolf let out a final, agonizing howl before she went silent, retreating into a dark corner of my mind and curling into a ball of catatonic grief. I stayed there, gasping for air that felt like broken glass, my forehead pressed against the cold stone. I was sweating, shaking, my vision blurred by tears that burned like acid. Dominic didn't move to help me. He didn't even flinch at the sound of my scream. He simply stood there, watching the stopwatch of my life reset to 0. "My beta, Marcus, has already packed your things," Dominic said, checking his gold Patek Philippe watch. The ticking of the clock seemed incredibly loud in the sudden hollow silence of the room. "There is a car waiting at the gates. It will take you to the airport or wherever you choose to go. A trust fund has been established in your name, enough to ensure you never have to work again. Consider it a parting gift for your cooperation." I looked up at him through the curtain of my hair. My chest was still heaving, and the phantom pain of the severed bond was pulsing in my throat. "You're paying me off?" I managed to choke out. "Like a disgruntled employee?" "I am ensuring a clean break, Stacy. It's better this way, for everyone." He turned his back on me then. It was the finality of it that killed me. He didn't even wait for me to leave. He walked toward his mahogany desk, picked up a leather-bound folder, and began to read. "Dominic," I whispered one last time. "Leave, Stacy," he said, not looking up. "I have a dinner engagement with Elena and her father at 8. I'd prefer it if you weren't on the property when we return." I forced myself to my feet. Every muscle felt like it had been shredded. My wolf was a heavy, dead weight in my chest. I felt empty. Not the emptiness of a vacuum, but the emptiness of a house that had been gutted by fire. All the furniture was gone. All the memories were scorched. Only the blackened shell remained. I didn't look at him again. I couldn't. I walked out of the great hall, my legs trembling so violently I had to lean against the cold stone walls for support. The guards at the door, men I had shared breakfast with, men who had bowed to me as their future Luna only yesterday, now looked straight through me. I was a ghost. I was the forgotten Luna. I didn't go to the car. I didn't want his money. I didn't want his mercy. I walked to the small cottage on the edge of the estate where I had kept my things. I found a single overnight bag. I stuffed it with a pair of jeans, a sweater, and a framed photo of my mother. As I zipped the bag, a sudden, sharp wave of nausea rolled through me. I gripped the edge of the dresser, waiting for it to pass. I assumed it was the shock. I assumed it was the rejection sickness. I didn't know that my body was already beginning to protect something. I didn't know that as the bond was dying, a new life was beginning, a life that carried the Blackmoor scent, the Blackmoor power, and a destiny that Dominic had just tried to throw away. I walked out of the cottage and into the rainy night. I didn't look back at the steel and glass towers of the Blackmoor estate. I didn't look at the man who had unmade me. I walked toward the gate, a single bag in my hand, and a secret in my blood that would eventually bring an empire to its knees. The Greyhound bus smelled like stale coffee, unwashed denim, and the slow, grinding death of dreams. I pressed my forehead against the vibrating window, watching the state lines blur into a smear of rain-slicked asphalt and skeletal trees. Every mile felt like a stitch being ripped out of my skin. In the werewolf world, territory is everything. It is the soil in your bones. It is the frequency your wolf tunes into to feel safe. Leaving the Blackmoor Pack lands was like unplugging a life support machine. The further we drove, the quieter my inner wolf became, until she was nothing but a cold, heavy stone in the pit of my stomach. I was officially a rogue, a wolf without a home, a lunar orphan. To most shifters, that was a death sentence or a descent into madness. To Dominic Blackmoor, it was just a line item he'd successfully cleared from his ledger. I stepped off the bus in the neutral zone city of Oak Haven at 4 in the morning. Oakhaven was a sprawling, concrete labyrinth where the supernatural and the mundane collided in a messy, neon-lit heap. It was the kind of place where you could disappear if you had enough grit, and where no one asked why a girl with haunted eyes was carrying a single, frayed overnight bag. The air here didn't taste like the crisp, pine-scented winds of the Blackmoor Mountains. It tasted like exhaust fumes, wet pavement, and the ozone of the subway. It was perfect. It was a place where the scent of an alpha wouldn't linger, because there were too many competing smells to track a ghost. I found a room in a boarding house above a 24-hour laundromat. The wallpaper was peeling in long, jaundiced strips, and the radiator hissed like a cornered viper. But it had a lock on the door and a window that looked out onto an alleyway. I sat on the edge of the saggy mattress and waited for the rejection sickness to kill me. They say that when an alpha rejects a fated mate, the physical toll can stop a heart. For the first week, I thought it would. I spent my days curled in a fetal position, shivering through fever dreams where Dominic's voice echoed in the great hall, repeating those jagged final words. "You are not what the Blackmoor legacy requires." I vomited until there was nothing left but bile. My joints ached as if they were being pulled apart by invisible pliers. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the phantom pull of the bond, a phantom limb that had been hacked off but still screamed with nerves that didn't know they were dead. But by the 10th day, something shifted. The nausea didn't go away. In fact, it sharpened. It wasn't the dull, soul-crushing ache of the rejection anymore. It was something targeted, something rhythmic. I was standing at the small, rusted sink in my room, splashing cold water on my face, when a scent hit me. It wasn't the smell of the city. It was something internal, a sweetness. A spark of electricity that shouldn't have been there, because the man who owned that scent had cut me out of his life. I froze, my hands dripping into the basin. "No," I whispered to the cracked mirror. "No, no." I walked 3 blocks to a pharmacy where the clerk didn't look up from his magazine. I bought 3 different tests, the plastic boxes feeling like lead weights in my hands. Back in the boarding house, I sat on the floor of the communal bathroom, the flickering fluorescent light overhead humming a mocking tune. I waited. 1 minute. The sound of the laundromat dryers thumping below. 2 minutes. The muffled shout of a drunk in the alleyway. 3 minutes. I looked down. 2 blue lines. On all 3. The world didn't tilt this time. It solidified. I wasn't just Stacy Cole anymore. I wasn't just the girl Dominic Blackmoor didn't want. I was a vessel. I was carrying the Blackmoor heir, the very legacy Dominic was so obsessed with protecting that he destroyed me to secure it. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste on my tongue. He had rejected me because I brought no political power, no strategic alliance. And yet, here I was, holding the only thing in the world that could truly secure his bloodline, and he didn't even know it existed. My wolf, who had been catatonic for nearly 2 weeks, suddenly stirred. She didn't howl. She didn't whine. She let out a low, predatory hum that vibrated in my chest. She wasn't grieving anymore. She was guarding. I stood up, threw the tests into the trash, and walked back to my room. I didn't cry. The time for tears ended the moment those lines turned blue. I had a choice to make, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let a man, alpha or otherwise, make it for me. I could go back. I could walk into the Blackmoor Great Hall, show Dominic the results, and watch him fall to his knees. He would take me back. He would marry me. He would give me the title of Luna. But I would be a prisoner. My child would be a calculation. He would grow up in a house of steel and ice, raised by a father who only valued him as a biological asset. He would be taught that power is everything, and that love is an inconvenient biological impulse. "Never," I whispered, resting my hand over my still flat stomach. I wouldn't give Dominic the satisfaction. He had called me not enough. Fine, then he didn't get the more that I was carrying. He had forfeited his right to this life the moment he chose a merger over a soul. I needed money. I needed a job. I needed to build a fortress of anonymity before the Blackmoor trackers realized I hadn't crawled into a hole and died. I found work at a place called the Root and Claw. It was a hole-in-the-wall apothecary owned by an elderly shifter named Silas, who had lost his sense of smell 40 years ago and didn't care about pack politics. He needed someone who knew herbs, someone who could mix the silver thistle poultices and the wolfsbane dilutes used for chronic pain. "You look like you've seen a ghost, girl," Silas grunted the first day I walked in. "I have," I said, reaching for a mortar and pestle. "I'm just waiting for the ghost to realize I've stopped haunting him." The work was grueling but grounding. I spent my days grinding roots and my nights studying the anatomy of my own changing body. Shifter pregnancies were faster than human ones and far more demanding. The child was an alpha. I could feel the drain on my energy, the way my wolf had to constantly funnel her strength into the tiny heartbeat flickering inside me. I ate until I was full and then ate some more. I walked through the city parks, letting the noise of the humans drown out the silence of my loneliness. By the end of the 3rd month, I was no longer the girl in the sundress. My hair was shorter, my eyes were harder, and I had traded my mid-tier softness for the lean, hungry look of a survivor. I was earning my own keep. I was paying my own rent. I was becoming someone Dominic Blackmoor wouldn't even recognize. But the city wasn't as empty as I thought. One rainy Tuesday evening, as I was locking up the shop, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't the sharp, agonizing burn of Dominic's presence. This was different. This was a heavy, grounding weight, a scent like damp cedar and ancient stone. I turned slowly, gripping a heavy brass weight from the scale. A man was standing in the shadows of the doorway. He was tall, taller than Dominic, with shoulders that seemed to take up the entire entrance. He wore a long, dark coat, and his eyes caught the glow of the neon open sign. They weren't amber, they were a deep, mossy green. "The shop is closed," I said, my voice steady despite the thudding of my heart. The man stepped into the light. He had a rugged, handsome face, not the polished, billionaire perfection of Dominic, but something more weathered, more real. There was a scar that ran through his left eyebrow, giving him a look of permanent, thoughtful curiosity. "I'm not here for the shop, Stacy Cole," he said. My heart plummeted. "Who sent you? Was it Dominic? If he thinks he can send a tracker to bring me back." "Dominic Blackmoor doesn't know I'm here," the man interrupted. His voice was like low thunder, vibrating in the small space of the apothecary. "And if he did, he'd likely try to kill me. My name is Voss." I let out a shaky breath, the brass weight slipping from my fingers and clattering onto the counter. Voss, the rival, the Blackmoor's greatest enemy. The alpha of the North who had been fighting Dominic's expansion for a decade. "What do you want?" I asked. Calum stepped closer, his movements fluid and deliberate. He didn't smell like a predator looking for a kill. He smelled like safety. It was a confusing, terrifying sensation. "I saw what happened at the Great Hall," Calum said softly. "I have people inside Blackmoor. I saw the way he discarded you, and I've been watching you here in Oakhaven." "You've been stalking me? I've been ensuring no one else was," he countered. He looked down at my waist, his eyes lingering for a second too long on the slight swell I was trying to hide under my oversized apron. He didn't look away when I caught him. He didn't smirk. He looked at me with an expression of profound, quiet respect. "He's a fool, Stacy," Calum said. "He thinks he can reject a mate, and the world will just keep spinning the way he wants it to. But the universe has a way of balancing the scales." "I don't need your help, Alpha Voss," I said, my wolf growling deep in my throat. "I'm doing just fine on my own." "Are you?" He tilted his head. "Because I see a woman who is exhausted. I see a wolf who is carrying the weight of a kingdom on her back. And I see a child who deserves more than a boarding house above a laundromat." I flinched. "You don't know anything about my child." "I know he carries the Blackmoor scent," Calum said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And I know that if Dominic finds out, he will turn this city into ash to take him from you. Not because he loves him, but because he owns him." He reached out, not to grab me, but to place a card on the counter. It was heavy, black cardstock with a silver wolf's head embossed on it. "My territory is 4 hours north," Calum said. "We don't care about mergers. We care about blood. We care about loyalty. If you want a place where you can be a mother instead of a fugitive, come to me. I won't ask for your bond. I won't ask for your secrets. I just want to see the look on Dominic's face when he realizes he threw away the sun and I was the one who caught it." He turned and walked out into the rain before I could find my voice. I stood in the darkening shop, the smell of cedar and stone lingering in the air. I looked at the black card on the counter. My hand was shaking. I was Stacy Cole. I was the forgotten Luna. And for the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't just running away from something. I was running towards something. I looked at the peeling wallpaper and the rusted sink. Then I looked at the card. "The scales are balancing, Dominic," I whispered. "And you have no idea how heavy the debt is becoming." The black card sat on my bedside table for 3 days. It seemed to pulse in the dark, a silver wolf's head staring at me with unblinking judgment. In those 3 days, Oakhaven felt smaller. The walls of my boarding house room seemed to move inward by an inch every hour. I started seeing Blackmoor crests in every passing black SUV, hearing Dominic's low, authoritative rumble in every thunderclap over the city. Paranoia is a hungry beast, and I was feeding it with every heartbeat of the alpha Heir inside me. I looked at my reflection in the communal bathroom mirror. My skin had a translucent quality, and the dark circles under my eyes were bruised purple. I was a fugitive in a city that didn't care if I lived or died, carrying a child whose very existence was a death warrant if found by the wrong hands. I packed my bag for the second time in 4 months. I didn't have much: a few more sweaters, a bottle of prenatal vitamins Silas had blended for me, and the heavy weight of a choice that felt like jumping off a cliff. The bus ride north was different from the one that brought me to the neutral zone. The flat, urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills of shale and pine. The air began to change, losing the chemical bite of the city and taking on a cold, sharpened edge that smelled of snow and ancient secrets. We were entering the Voss Pack lands, the Iron Mountains. When I stepped off the bus at the terminal in Grey Ridge, I expected a cold reception. I expected guards, silver-lined handcuffs, or at the very least, a shadowy interrogation room. Instead, I found Calum. He was leaning against a rugged, mud-spattered truck, his arms crossed over a thick shearling jacket. He wasn't wearing a suit. He looked like the mountains he ruled, hard, weathered, and immovable. When his green eyes found mine, he didn't smirk with the triumph of a man who had won a prize. He simply nodded, walked over, and took my bag. "You look like you haven't slept since the solstice," he said, his voice a low, grounding hum that settled the frantic fluttering of my wolf. "I've been busy," I replied, my voice raspy. "Building a life is exhausting work. Now you can stop building and start living," he said. He opened the passenger door for me. "The estate is another hour up the pass. The altitude can be a bit much for guests. If you feel lightheaded, tell me." He didn't say pregnant women. He didn't say the Blackmoor heir. He gave me the dignity of a title that didn't involve my womb or my past. As we climbed higher into the Iron Mountains, the sheer scale of the Voss territory became apparent. This wasn't the polished corporate power of the Blackmoor Pack. This was primal. We passed stone fortresses built into the cliffs and wolves running in their natural forms through the thickets, their fur frosted with rime. The Voss Manor was a sprawling fortress of dark timber and river stone, sitting on a plateau that overlooked a valley carved by glaciers. It looked like it had grown out of the earth rather than being built upon it. "This is the East Wing," Calum said, leading me through corridors lined with hand-woven tapestries and the faint scent of beeswax and cedar. He stopped at a heavy oak door. "It's yours, completely private. No one enters without your permission. Not even me." He pushed the door open. The room was massive, filled with the amber glow of a pre-lit fireplace. There was a bed with furs, a private bath, and, my breath caught, a small alcove filled with books on herbalism and midwifery. "Silas told me what you were studying," Calum said, his voice coming from behind me. "I thought you might want to continue your work. We have a pharmacy in the lower levels. It's been neglected since our last healer passed. It's yours to run, if you want it." I turned to him, my back to the fire. "Why, Selim? You're an alpha. You don't do anything without a reason. What is the price for this?" Calum stepped into the room, but he kept a respectful distance. He leaned against the doorframe, his moss-green eyes searching mine. "Dominic Blackmoor thinks the world is a game of chess. He thinks people are pawns to be sacrificed for a better position on the board. I hate chess, Stacy. I prefer the old ways." "The old ways?" "Protection," he said, and the word vibrated through the floorboards. "An alpha's true power isn't measured by his bank account or his territory. It's measured by the safety of those under his roof. You were discarded by a man who didn't deserve you. In my book, that makes you the most valuable person in this mountain range. My reason is that I want to prove him wrong. I want to see you thrive just to spite his narrow-minded version of legacy." He started to close the door, then paused. "And Stacy, the kitchen is open 24 hours. My cook Martha has been told you're eating for two, and that you have a preference for tart apples and protein. Don't starve yourself out of pride." He closed the door, leaving me in the silence of the flickering firelight. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the softness of the furs a startling contrast to the lumpy mattress of the boarding house. My wolf let out a long, contented sigh, and finally, for the first time in months, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next few months were a blur of slow, steady healing. I took over the Voss apothecary, and within weeks I had organized the dusty shelves and replaced the stale tinctures with fresh blends. The pack members were wary at first. I was the Blackmoor woman, but as I healed their children's fevers and eased the alpha's old battle wounds, the suspicion turned into a quiet, sturdy respect. And through it all, there was Calum. He was a constant, low-frequency presence. He didn't hover. He didn't demand my time. But every morning, there would be a basket of fresh fruit outside my door. Every evening, he would find me in the apothecary and ask about my day, listening with an intensity that made me feel like my words were the most important thing in the territory. He treated my pregnancy with a reverence that was almost painful. He never touched me without asking, but he was always there, a steady hand to steady me when I tripped on the uneven stone paths, a silent shadow when I walked the perimeter of the estate. One night, during my 7th month, the moon was full and heavy, hanging over the mountains like a silver coin. I was sitting on the terrace, my hands resting on the hard, active curve of my stomach. The baby was restless, kicking with a strength that made me wince. "He's going to be a runner," a voice said from the shadows. Calum stepped out, a glass of water in his hand. He handed it to me and leaned against the stone railing. "He's going to be a handful," I corrected, feeling another sharp jab against my ribs. Calum looked at my stomach, his expression softening into something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't the look of a rival alpha calculating his enemy's bloodline. It was something more human, more vulnerable. "Does it hurt?" he asked softly. "Sometimes. Mostly it just feels crowded, like there isn't enough room in me for everything he's going to be." Calum reached out, his hand hovering an inch above my bump. "May I?" I hesitated. The bond with Dominic was dead, but the biological reality of who this child belonged to was still a jagged glass shard in my heart. But Calum wasn't Dominic. He had never been Dominic. "Yes," I whispered. He pressed his large, warm palm against my stomach. The moment he made contact, the baby, who had been thrashing for an hour, instantly went still. A strange, calm heat radiated from Calum's hand into my skin. Calum let out a ragged breath. "He's powerful, Stacy. Even now, I can feel the spark in him." "He's a Blackmoor," I said, a trace of the old bitterness leaking into my voice. Calum looked up at me, his green eyes locked onto mine. "No, he's yours. Blood is just the map, Stacy. You're the one who's going to teach him how to walk the path. And if you'll let me, I'd like to help you build that path." He didn't pull his hand away. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, connecting with a child that wasn't his, in a territory that was supposed to be hostile, offering a future that seemed too beautiful to be real. In that moment, the silence of the mountains was broken by a distant, mournful howl from the south, from Blackmoor territory. It was a sound of grief, of a pack losing its way. I looked at Calum, and for the first time, I didn't see a rival. I didn't see an alpha. I saw a man who had chosen to be the lighthouse in my storm. "He's kicking again," I whispered, a small smile tugging at my lips. Calum laughed, a rich, warm sound that echoed off the valley walls. "Good, let him kick, let him know he's home." I wasn't the forgotten Luna anymore. I was Stacy. And I was beginning to realize that sometimes the fate the universe gives you is just a suggestion. The fate you choose for yourself is the one that actually matters. The blizzard that brought Leo into the world was the kind of storm that rewrites the geography of the mountains. It howled against the stone walls of the Voss Manor, a white-out fury that made the rest of the world feel like a distant, faded memory. Inside the east wing, the air was thick with the scent of dried lavender, boiling water, and the sharp, metallic tang of shifting energy. Shifter births are not quiet affairs. They are a battle between two souls, the mother's will and the child's instinct to break free. I gripped the iron bedpost so hard, the metal groaned under my strength. My wolf was no longer hiding. She was at the surface, her golden eyes bleeding into mine, her growl merging with my screams. Every contraction felt like a tectonic plate shifting in my pelvis. Deep breaths, Stacy, Martha, the pack's head cook and impromptu midwife, urged. She wiped my brow with a cloth that was instantly soaked with sweat. He's an alpha girl. He's not going to come quietly. He wants the world to know he's arrived. Through the haze of pain, I saw a shadow by the door. Calum. He wasn't supposed to be there. Traditionally, an alpha stayed in the Great Hall during a birth that wasn't his own. But Salem wasn't traditional. He stood in the doorway, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked like he wanted to reach out and pull the pain from my body with his bare hands. Get, I wheezed, another wave of agony crashing over me. I'm not leaving you, Stacy, he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of my senses. Focus on my voice. Don't let the pain take you. Stay with me. I hated him in that moment. I hated Dominic for starting this. I hated the moon for choosing me. But as Calum stepped closer and took my hand, his palm rough and warm, I felt a surge of borrowed strength. He wasn't my mate, but he was my witness. Then came the final, shattering push. The room seemed to explode in a burst of white light and a roar that didn't come from my throat. It was the sound of a legacy being born. Not the sterile corporate legacy Dominic had dreamed of, but something raw, ancient, and undeniable. Then silence. The blizzard outside seemed to hold its breath. Martha moved quickly, her hands sure and steady. A moment later, a thin, sharp wail pierced the air. It wasn't the cry of a human baby. It was the yip of a wolf pup finding his lungs. A son, Martha whispered, her face glowing with a fierce, pack-deep pride. She cleaned him and wrapped him in a soft gray fur before placing him in my trembling arms. I looked down, and my heart didn't just beat, it sang. He was beautiful. He had a tuft of dark hair and skin the color of cream. But when he opened his eyes, my breath hitched. They were dark, stormy, and carried the unmistakable weight of the Blackmoor line. He was a miniature of the man who had discarded me, yet he felt entirely mine. Selim leaned over us, his shadow falling protectively across the bed. He looked at the boy, the son of his greatest rival, and he didn't flinch. He reached out a finger, and Leo's tiny hand instinctively curled around it. Leo, I whispered. His name is Leo. A lion in a den of wolves? Calum murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He's perfect, Stacy. The months that followed were a sanctuary of quiet routines and soft light. Leo didn't just grow, he thrived. He was walking at 6 months, his coordination terrifyingly advanced. By 8 months, he was already shifting his ears and tail in his sleep, his scent growing more potent every day. It was a scent of cedar, Voss territory, mixed with the underlying thunder of Blackmoor blood. I spent my days in the apothecary with Leo strapped to my chest in a sling. He loved the smell of the herbs, his little hands reaching for the bundles of dried sage and chamomile. The Voss Pack had stopped calling me the Blackmoor woman. Now, I was simply the healer. But while my world was filling with light, the South was descending into darkness. Reports started coming in through the traders and the rogue networks. The Blackmoor Pack was fracturing. The merger with the Silver Moon Syndicate had become a cage. Lady Elena was a tyrant, and Dominic was unraveling. He's lost his scent, one of the Voss scouts reported during a meeting in the Great Hall that I happened to overhear. He moves like a machine, but the wolf in him is starving. He's purged half his board of directors. The pack is scared of him. I sat in the corner of the room, nursing Leo, my heart chilling at the news. I didn't want Dominic to suffer. I wanted him to be irrelevant. But an alpha without a wolf is a dangerous, unpredictable thing. He's looking for something, Salem said, his eyes finding mine across the hall. He's been sending trackers into the neutral zones. He's obsessed with finding where Stacy went. Let him look, I said, my voice cold. He won't find a girl in a sundress anymore. He doesn't have to find the girl, Calum said softly, walking over to me after the scouts had been dismissed. He just has to find the scent of his own blood. Leo is getting stronger, Stacy. His alpha signature is starting to leak past our borders. Shifters 3 territories away are starting to feel the ripple. I looked down at Leo, who was currently trying to chew on a wooden teething ring. What do we do? Calum knelt in front of us. In the past year, the space between us had narrowed. The no-strings agreement had long since melted into something deeper, a quiet, domestic intimacy built on shared midnights and the mutual protection of the boy between us. We stop hiding, Calum said. We make it official. If you are the Luna of the Voss Pack, Dominic cannot touch you without starting a war that would end his empire. And if Leo is legally my heir, his claim to Blackmoor becomes a secondary issue. My heart hammered. You would do that? You would claim another man's son as your heir? It would complicate your own lineage, Calum. Your elders will lose their minds. Calum took my hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles. I don't care about the elders, and I don't care about the blood in his veins. I care about the boy who calls me Dada when he thinks I'm not listening. I care about the woman who turned this fortress into a home. He looked at me with a raw, terrifying honesty. I'm not Dominic, Stacy. I don't want a merger. I want you. I've wanted you since the moment I saw you standing in that apothecary with a brass weight in your hand, ready to fight the world. I looked at him, the man who had caught me when I fell, the man who had loved a child that wasn't his, the man who had given me a kingdom when I had nothing but an overnight bag. Yes, I whispered. Yes, Calum. The wedding announcement was sent out 2 weeks later. It was a masterpiece of political provocation. We didn't just announce a marriage, we announced the union of the Voss Pack and the Forgotten Luna. We announced the presence of an heir. The invitations were sent to every major pack. It was a declaration of war wrapped in a white envelope. On the night before the wedding, I stood on the balcony of the East Wing, looking south toward the Blackmoor Mountains. For the first time in a year, I reached out with my mind, searching for the old, severed bond. I didn't find a connection. I found a void. But in that void, I felt a flicker of recognition. Far away, in a cold office atop a steel tower, Dominic Blackmoor had just opened his mail. I felt his shock. I felt the sudden, violent roar of his wolf waking up from its year-long slumber. I looked down at Leo, sleeping soundly in his crib, and I didn't feel afraid. He's coming, I whispered to the night. Let him come. Calum's voice sounded behind me as he wrapped his arms around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. Let him see what it looks like when a man actually keeps what he finds. The stage was set, the players were moving, and tomorrow, the most powerful man in the supernatural world would have to sit in a guest chair and watch the legacy he threw away walk down the aisle into the arms of his greatest rival. The morning of the wedding, the Iron Mountains were draped in a shroud of silver mist that clung to the jagged peaks like a burial shroud. Inside the Voss Manor, the air didn't hum with the usual pre-ceremony excitement. It vibrated with a low-frequency tension that made the glass chandeliers tremble. Every guard on the perimeter was shifted, their predatory eyes scanning the mountain passes. Every guest was a political landmine. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the East Wing, my breath hitching as Martha fastened the last of the silk-covered buttons down my spine. The dress was a masterpiece of defiance. It wasn't the virginal, lace-heavy gown a discarded woman was expected to wear. It was heavy, structured silk the color of moonlight, with a high collar and long sleeves, more armor than apparel. You look like a queen, Stacy, Martha whispered, her rough hands smoothing the fabric over my hips. Not a Luna of a pack, but a queen of a realm. I looked at my reflection. My face had leaned out, the soft, desperate girl from the Blackmoor Great Hall, replaced by a woman with eyes like flint. I looked down at Leo, who was sitting on a plush rug at my feet. At nearly a year old, he was a force of nature. He was dressed in a tiny charcoal gray suit, his dark hair, the Blackmoor hair, falling over his forehead in rebellious waves. Dada? Leo asked, looking up at me with those stormy, intelligent eyes. He's waiting for us, Leo, I said, my voice barely a whisper. We're going to show everyone how brave we are. I picked him up, his solid weight a grounding presence against my chest. This was it. The moment I walked out those doors, I wasn't just marrying Calum, I was reclaiming the narrative of my own life. The chapel of the Voss estate was an ancient structure of river stone and dark oak. built into the side of the mountain. As the heavy doors groaned open, the collective intake of breath from the assembled guests hit me like a physical wave. The room was a who's who of supernatural power. Alphas from the western plains, elders from the southern swamps, and political strategists from the neutral zones. They were all there to see the scandal of the century. But I only felt one presence. He was sitting in the third row on the aisle. Dominic Blackmoor. He looked diminished. In the year since he had broken the bond, he had become a ghost of the man I knew. His bespoke suit hung slightly loose on his frame, and his face was a mask of cold, brittle exhaustion. He looked like a man who had spent a year breathing ash. The moment our eyes met, the ghost of the severed bond let out a phantom shriek. I saw his pupils dilate until his eyes were almost entirely black. He looked at me, and I saw the recognition, not of the woman he'd rejected, but of the power I now carried. Then his gaze dropped to the boy in my arms. And then, it happened. The Alpha Heir scent didn't just drift through the chapel, it detonated. As I walked down the aisle, the heavy, ancient scent of the Blackmoor lineage, of lightning, cedar, and raw royal authority, erupted from Leo. It was a biological roar that silenced the room. The elders in the back rows stood up instinctively, their wolves bowing to a power that shouldn't have been there. Dominic's glass of water shattered in his hand. I didn't stop. I kept my pace steady, my chin level. I passed him, the scent of his shocked grief hitting me like a cold wind. I saw the moment he realized the math. I saw the moment he counted the months. I saw the moment he looked at Leo's face, his own face, reflected in a child he had never held, and realized that the inconvenience he had discarded was actually his heart, beating outside his chest. He half rose from his seat, a guttural sound starting in his throat, but the Voss guards shifted their weight, their hand-to-hand combat stances subtle but lethal. I reached the altar. Selim was waiting. He didn't look at Dominic. He didn't look at the shocked crowd. He looked at me with a grin that was both fierce and tender. He reached out and took Leo from my arms, hoisting the boy onto his hip as if he had been born there. "You're late," Caleb teased softly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the front rows. "I had to make sure my armor was straight," I replied. The ceremony was a blur of ancient vows. The Voss elder spoke of blood, stone, and the enduring strength of the pack. When it came time for the exchange of rings, Caleb took my hand, the same hand Dominic had refused to hold in public, and kissed my knuckles before sliding the heavy silver band onto my finger. "I, Caleb Voss, take you, Stacy Cole, as my Luna, my mate of choice, and my heart's sovereign. I claim your son as my son. I claim your future as my own. Let no man, no pack, and no law come between what the mountains have joined." The silence in the chapel was absolute. Dominic was a statue of agony 3 rows away. I could feel his wolf howling, a sound of such profound, belated realization that it made my own skin crawl. He was realizing that, while he was busy protecting an idea of a legacy, his actual legacy was being claimed by his greatest rival. "I do," I said, my voice ringing out through the stone hall, clear and vibrantly alive. As Caleb leaned in to kiss me, Leo reached out and grabbed both our faces, his tiny laugh echoing off the vaulted ceiling. It was the sound of a new kingdom beginning. The reception was held in the great hall, a space of firelight and roaring celebration. But the tension remained, a live wire running through the room. I spent the first hour greeting guests, my hand never leaving Selim's arm. "He's in the garden," Caleb whispered in my ear, his eyes scanning the crowd. "He's been standing by the fountain for 20 minutes. He looks like he's about to shift and tear the world apart." "I need to talk to him," I said. "Stacy, I need to close the circle, Selim. If I don't, he'll haunt our borders forever. I need him to see me." Caleb searched my face for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll be 20 paces away. If he so much as growls, I'm ending it." I walked out into the cool mountain air. The garden was a maze of silver-frosted hedges and stone statues. I found Dominic standing by the black marble fountain, his hands gripping the edge so hard the stone was hairline fracturing under his strength. "Dominic," I said. He spun around. The polished alpha was gone. In his place was a man whose soul had been flayed open. "How?" he rasped. His voice was a wreckage. "How could you not tell me?" "I didn't tell you because you weren't there, Dominic," I said, walking toward him until the fountain stood between us. "You rejected me. You invoke the old words. You told me I was a political vacuum. Why would I tell a man like that about a child like Leo? He is my son, Dominic roared, his eyes flashing a violent, unstable gold. He is the Blackmoor heir? You had no right to steal him from his heritage. His heritage, I laughed, and the sound was cold. His heritage was a man who chose a merger over a soul. His heritage was a father who looked at his mother and saw a deficit. I didn't steal him, Dominic. I saved him. I gave him a father who chose him before he even knew his name. I will take him back. Dominic stepped toward me, his power flaring, the air around him beginning to shimmer with the heat of his wolf. I will dismantle this pack. I will sue. I will fight. I will. You will do nothing, I said, not flinching. Because if you touch a hair on his head, or if you step 1 foot over the Voss border again, I will tell the world exactly why you rejected your fated mate. I will tell the Silver Moon Syndicate that you chose them because you were too weak to handle the power of a true bond. You've already lost your scent, Dominic. Don't lose your life too. He stopped. The heat vanished, replaced by a crushing, hollow cold. He looked at me, and for the first time, he really saw me. He saw the woman who had survived him. Stacy, he whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't know, the bond. I thought I could control it. You controlled it right out of existence, I said. And now, you get to sit in the audience and watch someone else be the man you were too afraid to be. I turned my back on him then, just as he had turned his back on me in the great hall. I walked toward the light of the manor, toward the sound of my son's laughter and the man who was waiting to hold me. Dominic didn't follow. He stayed in the dark, a billionaire alpha with everything in the world and absolutely nothing at all. The 6 months following the wedding were the loudest silence I had ever experienced. To the outside world, the Voss Pack was a rising sun, its influence stretching across the northern territories like a slow-moving glacier. But to the south, the Blackmoor Empire was a house of cards in a hurricane. Dominic didn't go to war. He didn't sue. He did something much more devastating. He began to hollow out. Reports from the neutral zone said he had stopped attending board meetings. The Silver Moon Syndicate merger, once his crown jewel, had become a noose. Lady Elena had been seen leaving the Blackmoor estate in a fury, rumors swirling that Dominic had refused to touch her since the day of our wedding. A mate bond rejection is a wound, but seeing the physical manifestation of what you threw away, that is an infection. I sat in the Voss conservatory, watching Leo play on the rug. He was 18 months old now, and the Blackmoor thunder in his blood was becoming harder to contain. When he was frustrated, the air around him grew heavy, and the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch toward him. He wasn't just an alpha. He was a legacy that had been forged in the fires of a broken bond and tempered in the ice of the mountains. He's staring at the south again, Calum said, stepping into the room. He smelled of pine and wood smoke, a scent that had become my anchor. He can feel him, I whispered, watching Leo press his small hand against the glass of the window, looking toward the distant, jagged peaks of the Blackmoor Range. The blood calls to blood, Selim, no matter how much I want to pretend it doesn't. Calum sat beside me, his large hand covering mine. It's not a threat, Stacy. It's a haunting. Dominic is a ghost in his own life. He's been sending messengers to the border every week. Not with demands, with offerings. He pointed to a small wooden crate on the table. It was filled with rare, ancient herbs I had mentioned in an old journal Dominic must have kept. Herbs that only grew in the deepest, most dangerous parts of the Blackmoor caverns. I don't want them, I said, my voice trembling. He knows, Salem said softly. That's why he doesn't send notes. He just sends the things you need. It's the only way he knows how to speak anymore. The first real crack in the peace came during the autumn equinox. The Voss Pack was hosting the Great Hunt, a tradition where the wolves ran the ridges to mark the change of season. I was in the apothecary grinding dried valerian when a scent hit me. It wasn't the cedar of Selim or the thunder of Leo. It was the smell of a dying star, burning, cold, and desperately faint. Dominic was at the gate. He wasn't in a black SUV. He wasn't surrounded by guards. He was standing in the mud of the mountain pass, wearing a simple wool coat, looking like a man who had walked halfway across the world just to breathe. Calum met him at the perimeter, his wolf visible just beneath the surface of his skin, a low growl vibrating through the valley. I watched from the balcony, Leo gripped tightly in my arms. "You have no business here, Blackmoor." Calum's voice echoed off the rocks. "The borders were closed to you by the Luna herself." Dominic didn't look at Calum. He looked up. His eyes found mine on the balcony, and the grief in them was so profound it nearly brought me to my knees. He looked like a man who had seen the bottom of the universe and realized it was empty. "I'm not here for a pack," Dominic called out, his voice cracking. "I'm not here for a merger. I am dying, Calum." The silence that followed was absolute. The rejection sickness, I whispered to myself. It was rare, but documented. When an alpha rejects a fated mate, and that mate finds a new, stronger connection, the rejected bond can turn inward. It becomes a parasite, eating away at the alpha's wolf until there is nothing left but a human shell. Dominic hadn't just lost his scent, he was losing his life force. Calum looked back at me, his expression a mix of fury and hesitation. He knew the laws of the mountains. A dying alpha was a tragedy, but a dying alpha who had wronged a Luna was a pariah. "Let him in," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried on the wind. "Stacy, no," Calum barked. "Let him in, Calum, not as a guest, as a patient." I looked down at Dominic, who had collapsed to one knee in the mud. "I am a healer, and I won't have his death on my conscience or on Leo's bloodline." The infirmary of the Voss Manor felt like a tomb as we brought Dominic inside. He was burning with a fever that smelled like scorched earth. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his pulse was a frantic, irregular drumbeat. I stood over him, my hands glowing with the soft green light of my healing gift. Beside me, Leo stood on a stool, watching the man in the bed with wide, unblinking eyes. "Who?" Leo asked, pointing a small finger at Dominic's face. "A man who made a very big mistake, Leo," I said, my heart aching. Dominic's eyes fluttered open. The gold was gone, replaced by a dull, aching brown. He saw Leo, and for a moment the fever seemed to break. He reached out a trembling hand, stopping inches from the boy's cheek. He is so strong," Dominic rasped. "He is a Voss now," I said firmly, though my hand trembled as I applied a cool poultice to his forehead. "His soul is anchored here. But his blood is crying for you to stay alive, Dominic, not for your sake, but for the balance of the world." "I see it now," Dominic whispered, tears tracking through the grime on his face. "The steel, the towers, they were nothing. I built a throne of glass and wondered why I was cold. Stacy, I am so sorry. Not for the legacy. For you. I missed the woman because I was looking for a queen." "You found both," Calum said, stepping into the room. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked like a man watching a fallen king. "But you found them too late. I worked through the night, blending the very herbs Dominic had sent to the border. It was the ultimate irony. He had provided the ingredients for his own survival. I channeled my energy, not into the bond, that was gone, but into the biological thread that connected him to Leo. I used the son to save the father, weaving a new kind of tether that would keep Dominic's wolf from fading into nothing. As the sun began to peek over the Iron Mountains, Dominic's fever finally broke. His breathing leveled out, and a faint, silver light returned to his skin. He wouldn't die, but he would never be the Alpha Prime again. He would be a man in shadow, forever looking toward a light he had walked away from. He stayed for 3 days to recover. He spent most of those days watching Leo from a distance. He didn't try to touch him. He didn't try to claim him. He sat in the garden, a shattered mirror of a man, watching Calum teach Leo how to shift his paws for the first time. On the morning he left, I met him at the gate. "The Blackmoor pack needs a leader," I said. "Go back, fix what you broke, fire the syndicate, build something that doesn't require a soul for a down payment." Dominic looked at me, his face weathered but clear. "And the boy? He will know who you are," I said. "But he will always know who Selim is. One gave him life, the other gave him a life worth living. If you can accept that, you can come back once a year for his birthday." Dominic bowed his head. It wasn't a political gesture. It was the submission of a man who had finally found his humanity. "I accept," he said. As his car drove down the mountain pass, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The revenge I thought I wanted, the dramatic downfall, the public shaming, felt hollow compared to the peace of the garden behind me. I walked back into the manor where Selim was waiting. He picked me up and swung me around, his laugh echoing through the halls. "Is he gone?" Selim asked. "He's gone," I said, "and the shadow went with him." But as I looked at Leo, who was currently chasing a butterfly with a ferocity that would one day make him the most powerful alpha the world had ever seen, I knew the story wasn't over. It was just changing shape. The forgotten Luna was a memory, the healer of the North was a reality. And the Heir? The Heir was the bridge between two worlds that had once tried to destroy each other. 15 years is a lifetime in the world of shifters, but in the Iron Mountains, time is measured by the deepening of the scars on the pines and the steady, terrifying growth of Leo Voss Blackmoor. At 16, Leo was no longer the boy who chased butterflies. He was a lightning rod of raw, kinetic energy. He stood 6'2", with the broad, immovable shoulders of Calum and the sharp, aristocratic bone structure of Dominic. But it was his eyes that stopped people in their tracks. A swirling, unstable amber green that looked like a forest fire reflected in a mossy pond. He was the pride of the Voss Pack and the unspoken obsession of the Blackmoor Empire. And tonight, under the blood moon of the autumn equinox, he was about to break. "He's running too hot, Stacy," Selim said, his voice tight with an anxiety he only ever showed to me. We stood on the high stone balcony of the manor, watching a dark shape tear through the tree line at speeds that should have been physically impossible for a human form. "It's the dual inheritance," I whispered, gripping the cold railing. "Dominic's blood is all precision and predatory dominance. Your influence is grounded, earthbound strength. They're fighting for control of his marrow, Selim. The first shift is going to be a battlefield." In the decade and a half since the wedding, the world had settled into a precarious peace. Dominic had kept his word. He had dismantled the syndicate, rebuilt the Blackmoor Pack into a meritocracy, and visited once a year. He was the uncle in the shadows, the man who sent Leo rare books on ancient warfare and high-tech training equipment. He had never tried to take him back, but the tether was there, pulsing like a live wire. A roar echoed from the valley floor, a sound so deep it vibrated in my teeth. It wasn't a wolf's howl yet. It was the sound of a boy being unmade. "It's time," I said. We found Leo in the sacred grove, a circle of ancient white oaks where the veil between the worlds was thinnest. He was stripped to the waist, his skin slick with sweat despite the freezing mountain air. His muscles were leaping under his skin like trapped birds, and his fingernails were already curving into blackened talons. "Get back," Leo gasped, his voice cracking into a guttural snarl. "Mom, Dad, it feels like I'm burning from the inside out." "You're not burning, Leo." Selim stepped forward, his own alpha presence expanding to create a literal dome of calm around the boy. "You're expanding. Don't fight the change. Welcome it. You are the son of the mountains. You are the heir of the steel. Command them both." Suddenly, the air pressure in the grove plummeted. A familiar scent drifted through the trees. Not the cedar of the north, but the sharp, electric tang of a southern storm. Dominic Blackmoor stepped out from behind a great oak. He looked older, his hair silvered at the temples, but the power he had recovered since his hollowing was focused and intense. "What are you doing here, Dominic?" I demanded, my wolf rising to the surface, teeth bared. "This is a Voss right." "He is my blood, Stacy," Dominic said, his eyes fixed on the agonizing boy in the center of the grove. "And he is hitting the Blackmoor wall. If he doesn't have the frequency of his biological line to anchor him right now, the shift will tear his mind apart. He's too powerful for a single pack transition." Calum growled, a sound that shook the leaves above, but he looked at Leo, who was now screaming, his spine beginning to lengthen with sickening audible pops, and he stepped aside. "Do it," Calum rasped. "But if you try to claim him in this moment, Blackmoor, I will bury you under this mountain." Dominic knelt on one side of Leo. Calum knelt on the other. It was a tableau that would have been unthinkable 16 years ago. The rival kings, the two men who had defined my life, joining hands over the boy who was the bridge between them. "Listen to my heartbeat, Leo," Selim commanded, his voice a low, earthy thrum. "Stay grounded. Stay here with the stone and the soil." "Listen to the lightning, Leo," Dominic countered, his voice a sharp, resonant frequency. "Own the sky. Command the power. Do not let it command you." I stepped into the circle, placing my hands on Leo's forehead. My healing light flared, not to stop the pain, but to knit the tissues as they stretched, to ensure the unmaking didn't become a permanent breaking. "You are not a mistake, Leo," I whispered into his ear as the moon turned a deep, bruised crimson above us. "You are the answer to a question the world was too afraid to ask. Be the king of both." With a sound like a lightning strike hitting an oak, Leo shifted. It wasn't the lean gray wolf of the Voss or the massive, black-furred beast of the Blackmoor. A creature emerged that silenced the forest. He was colossal, larger than both alphas. His fur was a shimmering, metallic charcoal that seemed to catch the moonlight like armor. His eyes remained that haunting amber green, glowing with a sentient, ancient intelligence. He didn't howl. He stood on all fours, the sheer gravity of his presence making the two alphas recoil in instinctive submission. Leo, the first of his kind, looked at Selim and bowed his massive head. Then he turned to Dominic and did the same. Finally, he walked to me, huffing a breath that smelled of wildflowers and ozone, and rested his heavy head against my shoulder. I buried my face in his fur, tears of relief blurring my vision. "He did it," I breathed. The aftermath of the shift changed everything. The Forgotten Luna was no longer just a story of survival. It was the foundation of a new era. Dominic stayed for the week, and for the first time he sat at our table not as a guest or a patient, but as family. We discussed the future, not as a merger of companies, but as a federation of packs. Leo was the heir to both, a living treaty that rendered the old rivalries obsolete. On the final night of his visit, Dominic found me in the apothecary. I was mixing a soothing balm for Leo's sore joints. "He is more than I ever could have engineered," Dominic said, leaning against the doorframe. "You were right, Stacy. If I had won back then, I would have smothered that spark. He needed the mountains. He needed a father who knew how to love without a contract." "He needed all of it, Dominic," I said, looking up at him. "The rejection, the flight, the silence, and the return. It was the fire that forged him." Dominic nodded, a sad, peaceful smile touching his lips. "I'm stepping down next month. I'm handing the Blackmoor Alpha ship to a council until Leo is of age to take his seat. I think I'll buy a small cabin on the neutral zone border, somewhere I can see the mountains, but leave the steel behind." "You're always welcome here, Dominic," I said, and for the first time I meant it without reservation. He left the next morning. As his car disappeared down the pass, Caleb came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. We watched Leo, now in human form, laughing and sparring with a group of Voss sentinels, and I felt a profound sense of completion. The secret I had carried out of the Blackmoor Great Hall wasn't just a baby, it was a revolution. I looked at the silver ring on my finger and the scars on my soul, and I realized that every gut punch, every moment of invisibility, and every tear had been a payment on a life that was now blindingly bright. "What are you thinking about?" Chilam whispered. "I'm thinking about the woman in the white dress," I said. "The one who walked down the aisle with a secret and a dream. I want to tell her she was right. I want to tell her that she was always enough." Caleb kissed the top of my head. "She wasn't just enough, Stacy. She was the whole damn world." In the garden below, our son let out a joyful, powerful howl that echoed across the territories. A signal to anyone listening that the old world was gone, and the new one had only just begun. The invitations were not sent on gold-embossed cardstock this time. They were delivered by messenger wolves, their fur matted with the salt of the high seas and the dust of the southern plains. The message was singular. The air has risen. The blood is unified. Come to the Iron Mountains, or be left in the shadow of the new world. The high summit was the culmination of 16 years of silent preparation. Every major alpha from the continental reach was converging on the Voss estate. They weren't coming for a wedding or a funeral. They were coming to see if the rumors were true. They were coming to see the boy who had survived a broken bond to become a king of two worlds. But as the caravans began to snake up the mountain passes, a new scent began to drift on the wind. A sour, oily smell that made my wolf pace the length of the conservatory. "The Iron Claw remnant," Selim said, slamming a folder of satellite photos onto the mahogany table. "A splinter group of traditionalists from the neutral zones. They've spent the last decade radicalizing against the bastardization of the bloodlines. They see Leo as an abomination, Stacy. A threat to the purity of the shifter race. I looked at the photos. Armed convoys, silver-tipped ballistics, and rogue alphas who had been exiled years ago for their brutality. They were moving toward the mountain passes, timed perfectly for when the summit would be at its most vulnerable. They think we're soft, I said, my voice dropping an octave. They think because we chose peace, we've forgotten how to bleed. They're about to find out that peace is a luxury we bought with fire. Calum replied, his eyes flashing a dangerous, protective green. The great hall of the Voss Manor had been transformed into a war room. Tables were laden with maps, and the air was thick with the competing scents of dozens of alphas. Dominic sat at the far end of the table, his face a mask of cold, tactical focus. He was no longer the broken man from the garden, he was the general of the Blackmoor line. Leo stood at the head of the table. At 16, he possessed a gravity that made the older alphas shift uncomfortably in their seats. He didn't speak with the arrogance of a billionaire or the aggression of a mountain wolf. He spoke with the quiet, terrifying certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of. The Iron Claw are 5 miles from the southern pass, Leo said, his finger tracing the topographical map. They expect us to hunkering down in the manor. They expect a siege. They want to show the world that the United Packs are just a collection of frightened wolves behind stone walls. What do you suggest, Leo? Dominic asked, his voice carrying a note of pride he couldn't quite suppress. Leo looked up, and for a moment his eyes were pure, molten amber. I suggest we don't give them a siege. I suggest we give them a reckoning. We meet them in the Grey Valley. No walls, no retreats. We show them what a unified pack looks like. A murmur went through the room. The Grey Valley was a natural amphitheater, a kill box if you were unprepared, but a throne if you held the high ground. It's a risk, son, Calum warned. They have silver tech. They've been funded by the old money families who hate what we've built. Then let them bring their silver, Leo said, leaning over the table. My blood was forged in a rejection that should have killed me. My mother survived a year in the neutral zones with nothing but her will. If they think a few silver bullets can stop what we are, they've lived too long in the dark. I watched him, and my heart swelled with a fierce, terrifying love. He wasn't just my son. He was the answer to every person who had ever told me I was not enough. The Grey Valley was a sea of mist when we arrived. I stood on the ridge with the healers, my med kit strapped to my side, watching the two armies face each other. On one side, the Iron Claw, a jagged, ugly line of armored vehicles and wolves in heavy, silver-plated tactical gear. They look like a machine designed for slaughter. On the other side, the United Packs, the Voss Wolves in their natural, rugged glory, and the Blackmoor Sentinels in their sleek, disciplined ranks. In the center, standing alone in his human form, was Leo. The leader of the Iron Claw, a scarred, ancient alpha named Calum, stepped forward. He laughed, a sound like dry bones rattling in a jar. Is this the God King? Calum shouted, his voice amplified by the valley walls. A boy who smells like a crossbred mistake? You are an insult to our ancestors, boy. You are a stain on the moon. Leo didn't answer with words. He didn't even growl. He shifted. The transformation was instantaneous. There was no pain, no struggle. One moment he was a boy, and the next, the colossal, charcoal-gray wolf stood in the center of the valley. The ground beneath his paws seemed to groan under his weight. He let out a roar that physically pushed the mist back, revealing the sheer scale of the United Packs behind him. Calum and Dominic shifted simultaneously, flanking him like the twin pillars of a temple. For the Luna! Calum's mental howl echoed through the bond of every wolf on the ridge. For the legacy! Dominic's roar followed. The battle was a whirlwind of fur, steel, and blood. The Iron Claw's silver bullets hissed through the air, but they couldn't find a mark on Leo. He moved with a speed that defied physics, a blur of charcoal and teeth. He didn't just fight, he dismantled. He tore through the armored vehicles as if they were made of tin, his presence alone causing the enemy wolves to cower in instinctive terror. I ran through the chaos, my hands glowing with healing light, pulling Voss and Blackmoor wolves back from the brink of death. I saw Dominic take a silver-tipped spear to the shoulder to protect a young Voss scout. I saw Calum tear the throat out of an alpha who had tried to flank Leo. But the climax came when Calum, desperate and sensing his defeat, pulled a heavy-caliber silver rifle from his back. He aimed it directly at me, sensing that my death would be the only thing that could truly break the line. He didn't get the shot off. Leo didn't just jump. He flew. He landed on Kalen with the force of a falling star, the impact shattering the ground. He didn't kill him instantly. He shifted back into his human form, his hand wrapped around the old alpha's throat, his eyes burning with a light that wasn't human. "You speak of stains on the moon?" Leo whispered, his voice carrying through the sudden, shocked silence of the valley. "Look around you, old man. The moon didn't make this. We did, and we are the only future you have left." He dropped Kalen into the mud and turned his back on the remaining Ironclaw forces. They didn't fire, they didn't move. One by one, they dropped to their knees, their heads bowed in total, irrevocable submission. The summit didn't end in a feast, it ended in a treaty. We gathered on the floor of the valley, under the light of a moon that seemed brighter than it had in decades. Every alpha present signed the blood covenant. The Voss and Blackmoor territories were officially merged into the Union of the Crescent, with Leo as the supreme alpha. I stood between Selim and Dominic as the sun began to rise over the Iron Mountains. Dominic's shoulder was bandaged, and Selim had a deep scratch across his jaw, but they were both smiling. "You did it, Stacy," Dominic said, looking at the boy who was now receiving the homage of a dozen packs. "You saved us all. If you hadn't left that night, if you hadn't been strong enough to be nothing for a while, we would have burned ourselves out in our own pride." "I didn't do it alone," I said, taking Calem's hand. "I just chose to believe that the story wasn't over." Salem pulled me close, his scent of pine and peace wrapping around me like a blanket. "The world is finally quiet, Luna. Are you ready for what comes next?" I looked at my son, the king of two worlds, standing in the morning light. I looked at the man who had broken me, and the man who had rebuilt me. I looked at the mountains that had become my home. "I've been ready for 16 years, I said. The forgotten Luna was no longer a cautionary tale. It was a legend. And as the wolves of the Union let out a unified howl that shook the very foundations of the earth, I knew that the heir I had carried in secret was finally, truly, the master of his own destiny. The snow in the Iron Mountains no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a shroud of peace. 20 years had passed since I walked out of the Blackmoor Great Hall with nothing but a bruised soul and a secret. Today, the Union of the Crescent wasn't just a political treaty, it was a living, breathing ecosystem of packs that spanned the continent. The steel towers of the South still stood, but they were powered by the ancient, sustainable energy of the North. The old blood oaths had been replaced by a new kind of loyalty, one based on the choice to belong rather than the fear of being cast out. I stood in the center of the Voss Estate's royal garden, my hands buried in the rich dark soil of a new herbal patch. My hair was silvered now, a crown of moonlight that I wore with more pride than any tiara. "You're gonna ruin that silk, Stacy," a voice rumbled from the stone path. I looked up and smiled. Dominic Blackmoor was leaning against a marble pillar. He looked remarkably well for a man who had once been unmade. He spent most of his time now teaching history and strategy at the Union Academy, his sharp mind finally channeled into building mines rather than dismantling companies. "It's just silk, Dominic," I said, wiping a smudge of dirt from my forehead. "The soil is what matters. It's the only thing that remembers us when we're gone." He walked over and sat on a stone bench, watching me work. The tension that had defined our youth, the betrayal, the rejection, the agonizing reunion, had smoothed out into a quiet mutual respect. We were the architects of a bridge that had almost broken both of us. "Leo is presiding over the Council of Elders today," Dominic said, his eyes shining with a reflected glory. "He's proposing a new initiative for rogue integration. He speaks with your compassion, Stacy. But he has that Blackmoor steel when someone tries to interrupt him." "He has his father's backbone," I said, and for the first time in 2 decades, the word father didn't feel like a weapon. Both of them. As if summoned by the thought, Selim emerged from the manor. He was carrying a tray of tea and tart apples, the same snack he'd brought me during my first week in the mountains. He looked at Dominic, then at me, and let out a soft, contented huff. "The two of you are still gossiping about the king, I see," Caleb teased, setting the tray down. He knelt beside me, not caring about his own trousers, and helped me pat down the earth around a new sprig of silver thistle. We're reflecting, Caleb, I said, leaning my head against his shoulder. There's a difference. Well, reflect on this, Caleb said, gesturing toward the valley floor. Below us, the great hall doors opened. Leo stepped out into the afternoon light. He wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a young woman with hair the color of autumn leaves and a steady, certain gait. Behind them, a group of young pups, the next generation of the Union, tumbled through the grass, their yips of joy echoing off the mountain walls. Leo looked up toward the terrace. He didn't see a forgotten Luna or a rejected Alpha or a rival king. He saw his parents. He raised a hand in a silent salute, a gesture that acknowledged the fire we had walked through to give him this son. He's happy, Dominic whispered, almost to himself. I never thought, in all the years I spent calculating legacies, I never thought happiness was a metric that mattered. It's the only one that lasts, I replied. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had mixed tinctures in a lonely apothecary, the hands that had gripped an iron bedpost in the middle of a blizzard, the hands that had reclaimed a son from the shadow of a billionaire's pride. The story of the forgotten Luna wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't even a revenge story. Revenge is a fire that consumes the person who starts it. This was a story of emergence. It was about the moment a woman decides that the world's definition of her is a lie. I thought back to that wedding day, the gut punch in a white dress. I remembered the frozen look on Dominic's face when he realized his heir was walking toward his rival. I remembered the warmth of Caleb's hand when he claimed a family that wasn't convenient. But mostly, I thought about the silence. The quiet, steady silence of a garden in the afternoon sun, where a mother can watch her son grow without fear, where a woman can be seen clearly by the people she chose to love. Stacy? Caleb asked, sensing my drift. You okay? I looked at the two men who had shared the map of my life. I looked at the boy, the king, who was the living proof that out of rejection, an empire can be born. I'm more than okay, I said, standing up and brushing the earth from my knees. I'm exactly where I was always meant to be. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of cedar, lightning, and wildflowers across the Iron Mountains. It was the scent of a legacy that didn't need a name, a bond that didn't need the moon's permission, and a woman who had finally found her own reflection in the light of the living moon. The story was over, and for the first time, the silence was beautiful.